I'm not going to say something's wrong with me. I definitely don't want, but I just noticed I was different. And for many queer people, they say around grade 3 elementary school, that's when you start noticing. But see, the thing is, growing up in rural Manitoba or Selkirk in the 1980s, not a lot of knowledge or awareness or even media representation of what it is to be gay or queer, especially two-spirited. So I came out as gay in my last year of my first university degree, and that wasn't quite the proper fit. And then eventually I came out as transgender, and that wasn't quite the proper fit either. But remember, this was 15 plus years ago, and the language was maybe around, but wasn't public knowledge, right? So it's taken me 20 years to really kind of carve out my identity. And I'm an intersectional person, meaning gender, sexuality, Indigenous. And yeah, so what does two-spirited mean to me? So there's definitions like, I don't want to pick on Albert McLeod or any of my elders, but there's those kind of definitions, right? And I'm starting to accept them. But personally, I've never really accepted the fact gender roles. I've never enjoyed them. I always wanted to be in the kitchen with my aunties and grandmas and sisters growing up. And that's going to sound cliche, but I always hated gender roles, right? So what does two-spirited mean to me? I almost want to say it's the rejection of the binary. And that's more modern terminology, but you know what? I just want to be who I am without restrictions. And I think I've been talking for like 4 or 5 minutes. So I'll just kind of close this off is being non-binary, queer, two-spirited, they're all kind of related and everyone's different. So you just got to find what it is for you. And I'm 40 years old and it's taken me 20 years to feel comfortable in my own skin. And I'm sure I'm going to be exploring this for another 20 years. So, or 40 years. So I'm going to leave it right there. Thank you.
Thanks, Cory. So I actually forgot that I was also supposed to be monitoring the time and signaling to them. So that was my bad. But I want to thank you so much for sharing sort of your personal, you know, experience of coming to use this term. And I think it really speaks to this sort of fluidity, right, of our own identities, and then also the fluidity of language. But I really liked what you said about you just want to be who you are without restrictions. And I think that's really beautiful. So I'm going to open it up to Lucy to add on to this conversation.
Marcy Nicki, Tanchi Kiawa, Lucy Fowler Dishna Kashon, Dan Winnipeg Dushjan, Maga Dan Kiskea Niwikin, and Michif Nia. So I'm Lucy Fowler. I'm born and raised in Winnipeg, but I've been living in Kiskea since December, the land that's currently called the Dominican Republic. My family were Sinclairs, Cummings, McKays, and Prudence, who took script in St. Andrews. And I also have other family and ancestors from Red River, Oxford House, Norrie House, and Sioux Valley Dakota Nation. So as Nicki mentioned, I'm an academic and community organizer, mostly focusing on youth work. So the Mumway Project is kind of taking a lot of my focus recently. We're having a gathering next week, and as well do a lot of work with Red Rising magazine, of course the Two-Spirit Michif Local, and I'm on the National Two Spirits in Motion Society board as well. So when I think about what Two-Spirit means to me, it really took me a long time to come to use that particular term to describe myself. So several years ago, when I was living and working in Thunder Bay, Ontario, I went to a conference for my work there was a scholar there who was talking about Two-Spirit, different Two-Spirit stories from different communities, and how a lot of different First Nations had different words and different roles for Two-Spirit folks. And afterwards, I went and talked to him because I was really curious. I wanted to know more. Like, as a bisexual woman, that was the term I've always used. And so I wanted to talk to him about this. And he told me very abruptly that, Métis people can't be Two-Spirit because Métis people came about after colonization. And that was that. So for a long time, I didn't even think about using the term to represent myself, even though I did feel like a pull to be using that word. Bisexual doesn't fit me really, but it's like the easiest, most digestible way to kind of say my identity to the world. And it took years and years, and talking to Two-Spirit trailblazers like Alex Wilson and Barbara Bruce and other folks, that I really realized that the very nature of the term Two-Spirit is meant to be for all queer Indigenous peoples. It's not specific to communities. It's not something that excludes Métis or Inuit people. It's not just for First Nations, it's for all Indigenous peoples. And that's where the term came from when Myra Laramie brought it to that conference in 1990. It was because it was to create a term that would be something that folks could use across community and come to a common understanding. So I really love the way that Alex Wilson wrote something about what Two-Spirit means, and said that when someone states they're Two-Spirit, they're proclaiming an identity that honors and integrates sexuality, gender, culture, spirituality, and all other aspects of who they are. And so that really speaks to me about, how it's not just about who I'm attracted to, right? It's not just about, this this idea, like Cory was saying, beyond the binary, right? It's not just this everyone has a male and a female spirit in them. It's more than that. It's all of these different aspects of who we are. And using the term Two-Spirit, I feel like really it places me within community instead of at odds with community. When I was identifying as a bisexual woman, often I don't want to say that I have received violence, because I think folks who are really visibly queer, I would say I'm straight passing, right? So people who are visibly queer face actual physical violence, but I did feel pushed out of queer communities because of being bisexual and all of those discourses that go with that. And so for me, the term Two-Spirit means that I have this community of people with similar, not the same, but similar experiences to work beside and to call my kin. So that's all I'm sharing for now.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Yeah, I mean, you raised so many interesting points, drawing on Alex Wilson's research about this idea that, you're coming into community, you become part of community, and yourself as well, right? But I think you also raised some really important points of discussion around sometimes that Métis people aren't included in these spaces and these conversations, and that in some cases we might even experience lateral violence around this use of the Two-Spirit. And it's as the chair of our local, it's one of the questions that we receive most often is, can Métis people even call themselves Two-Spirit? So I wholeheartedly say yes, of course. But we'll hear more from Dorian Jensen now.
Hi, yes. Like was said in my introduction, I'm coming at you from Ottawa, which is the unceded and untreated territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, which I always try to really remember. I'm fortunate to be able to be here. And I was born in BC, but I have deep roots in the Winnipeg area. My people include a lot of names. I'm related to the Ducharmes, the Bouchards. My direct line of descent is the Delorme family. I'm a descendant of Pierre Delorme, who was on the provisional government, and that's something that's very meaningful to me. Yeah, I was really excited to be here and to start thinking about these questions in a systemic way. And as far as what Two-Spirit means to me, I thank you, Lucy, for that kind of history of it, because one thing I always think about is that, it was coined for a very practical purpose. It was coined to unite a really broad range of different Indigenous people with different relationships to sexuality and gender, and like have a term that could encompass, not all. I think it would be impossible to encompass all, but to encompass a lot of us and articulate something about our experiences, and something that is specifically different from how non-Indigenous people experience those things. And like, again, there's such diversity in Two-Spirit people, and you ask a group of us what it means, and you'll get so many different answers. For me, from the time I was a teenager, and when I was starting to really explore or think more about my gender and sexuality, I was growing up primarily with my dad's side of the family, who are white settlers, and I came out relatively early. I came out when I was 14 in 10th grade, or started to come out to myself and then eventually to other people. And at the time I came out as gay, and then in later years, I shifted my identity to queer because that didn't feel quite right. I explored other terms. I explored, other possibilities as far as gender and stuff, and nothing fit right. And then, I became more aware of Two-Spirit people and Two-Spirit teachings when I connected with at the time, the Aboriginal Resource Center at the University of Guelph, which I attended in in 2009 to 2012. And after I encountered Two-Spirit people, it took a while before I was willing to claim that term for myself, just because I had grown up in a way fairly separated from culture. And then I asked myself the same questions that, about like whether as a Métis person, like a post-colonial people, I had a right to the term. And then, I talked to people, I thought about it, and I decided based on those conversations that I did, and that it was the term that was most meaningful to me. And that's largely because of how it sort of fits outside a lot of these like Western or colonial conceptions of sexuality and gender. And also it's a term that has to do with or encompasses both those things, because I don't think for me those things are easily divisible from one another. And I don't think, like, when I think about my relationship to gender, like neither cisgender nor trans are words that I feel accurately describe or articulate my experiences. And it took a long time for me to figure out. I still don't think there's a good way for me to articulate how I understand my own relationship to gender in that Western framework. So I'm really grateful to Two-Spirit for capturing some of that duality and complexity and just being outside of that. So like, it's a term that's come to be a really meaningful one for me. And I think there's a lot of Indigenous queer people who don't identify with it and who find like the duality or feel that it's too binaristic. So it's not a good match for them. And that makes a lot of sense to me as well. But for me, it's a word I've taken a lot of meaning from. So those are kind of my thoughts.
Thank you, Dorian. So I especially like something that you said really early on about how that sort of, that Two-Spirit identity it's different from the way that non-Indigenous people might experience like their own gender and sexuality. And I think that that's a really interesting point that you made. And I also want to thank you for adding to this discussion that we're having about how Métis people in particular experience the process of like claiming Two-Spirit identity and using that terminology, right? That it's that it, in a way, it becomes something that we almost are doing simultaneously while we're also reclaiming our culture. So there's something like that they're related, right? That it's like, as we claim this identity, we say, yes, we're Indigenous people, and that this is like a beginning of our journey. And so I really like that. And then, I think that you acknowledged that this term Two-Spirit it's this English term, right? This umbrella term that encompasses all of these different Indigenous conceptions about gender and spirituality. And I think that's part of the beauty of the term, right? That when, Elder Myra Laramie coined that term in 1990, based on this dream that she had at the legislature here in Winnipeg, at the legislative building, I should say, that the idea was that it was a placeholder, right? Until we could remember those terms in our own languages. And so I really sort of like that, and I wanted to bring that into this discussion. But we'll move on now to our second question. And so I'm going to call on Lucy to talk about what roles do you see Two-Spirit Métis people playing, both historically and contemporarily in our communities?
Sure. Well, I'm going to speak more into the contemporary context because I'm definitely not much of a historian. But I think it's really important to remember that Two-Spirit Michif people are at the forefront of a lot of these movements that are happening across the lands that are currently called Canada. Land and water protection, pushes for defunding the police, and other movements that are gaining a lot of speed in the province. Things like renaming the streets and neighborhoods that currently commemorate people who have enacted violence in our communities. Like, for example, the Red River Echoes campaign to rename the Wolseley neighborhood. And Wolseley neighborhood in Winnipeg, that namesake comes from General Garnet Wolseley, who enacted what's known as the Reign of Terror on the Red River colony as part of those colonial efforts to dispossess us of our land, right? So there's a lot of different movements that are going on. There's some incredible work being done provincially and nationally for Two-Spirit people. And I'm really appreciative of organizations like Two Spirits in Motion that I mentioned. I sit on the board for that organization. And they've created space specifically for Métis people from the homelands to sit on that board. So I'm really thankful that national organizations are also opening up to create those areas for Two-Spirit Métis people to contribute to the national dialogue as well. And also specifically looking at our local, I'm really amazed by kind of the brilliance and creativity that our members have. So of course, everyone here on this panel, I could go on for a long time about Nicki and Cory and Dorian as well, but there's other folks who do amazing work as well. David Hendricks is also a member, and he is an incredible beater, just like unbelievable, and also a teacher, an incredible teacher. Chantal Fiola, who I think is here, who has just been named Distinguished Indigenous Scholars Chair at the University of Winnipeg, right? Like, people in this local are doing huge things and moving policies and organizations and affecting real lasting change. So I think that really speaks to, like, it's a small group, of course, but it really speaks to the efforts being made by Two-Spirit Métis people all across our homeland. So I think I'll just leave it there before I gush on too much about people who probably were like, stop talking, Lucy, but just some amazing people that I'm really thankful to be around and be able to hang out with, even if it's on Zoom.
Thanks, Lucy. And yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that, because it's true that there are so many Two-Spirit Métis people, and also Two-Spirit Métis youth and Métis youth generally, who are just doing such amazing things that we have to recognize the important work that they're doing too, that we often overlook, and sometimes overlook because they're youthful. And so just thank you for acknowledging that so much. So next, I'm going to open this up to Dorian to add on to this conversation.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I'll co-sign everything Lucy said, and I think, yeah, like, you look at a lot of social movements happening today, and not just ones that are like specifically rooted in Indigenous justice, but other stuff that that intersects with our issues, things like the climate movement especially. But every time you see like Indigenous people and Indigenous Two-Spirit in particular really at the forefront of a lot of those movements, which is really great to see. Historically, and I'm also definitely not a historian. But what I've heard over and over again in conversations with elders and with knowledge keepers, both Métis ones and people from other nations, is that like for a lot of nations, like Two-Spirit people served this this really important role as like, I guess, bridge builders or bridges in themselves, people who were able to move between these different spheres. And like in some contexts that meant between like male roles in ceremonies and female ones, but also just more generally, like people who were able to build connections and forge ties between people and sort of see like multiple sides and like really take in the complexities of a situation. And like through that knowledge and through that ability to understand those things, we're able to help people come to consensus or find a way forward, and just help people understand each other a little better. And I think that's something that like in those movements in the present day, I think like you see a lot of that in how Two-Spirit people end up carrying themselves in those spaces, is this sort of I guess like I don't want to say ambassadorial role, because that has a lot of structural implications in terms of the ways people do things, which are not necessarily the ways that Indigenous people would traditionally do things. But again, just forming connections between people and helping make our movements stronger due to that ability to connect people is, I think, historically where we were expected to shine, and in practice is a lot of where we still do, just in terms of our experiences have put us into this place where we've moved between things in a lot of senses. And I think that like a sort of expansiveness of perspective is a really valuable thing in community, and I think it's one that we're well suited to provide. That was a very circular answer. I think I meandered a little, but
No, not at all. That was great, Dorian. And I sort of really like this image that you conjured up for me when you talked about, being bridges and these like bridge builders. And I think if that's accurate, historically and even today, that role is often taken up by members of our community. And then I also liked what you said about sort of like moving between roles, like both gender roles and other roles, right? And I think that's another important point too, is that folks weren't pigeonholed into one particular role and sort of stuck there. That like Two-Spirit people filled many roles within a community and moved between those roles as well. So I really want to thank you for sharing that, and then invite Cory to add on.
Hi. So I've been thinking a lot about this question, and like I said, because of colonization and Christianity, a lot of our traditional knowledge was taken away from us. And so until recently, last 5 years, I really had no knowledge of like the definitions and the roles of what two-spirited people mean. But then I was thinking more in a larger context about being Indigenous, and like I was thinking about my family. Like one of my favorite things growing up was snowshoeing on the Red River, and that's something I still love doing. My grandpa hand carved duck hunting decoys. I remember my grandma talking about some of her older relatives speaking Bungi. And I'm not sure if you know what Bungi is, but it's more or less an extinct dialect of like Scottish, Cree, and English. And like all these still, and like my uncle has a deerskin jacket with floral patterns that we have no idea how old it is. And anyways, it's all these little remnants of who we are as an Indigenous people, and they survived. And I'm glad some of the tradition, I'm glad traditional knowledge survived despite the best efforts to eradicate it, so that we are rediscovering what two-spirited people are. Like, we never left, we were always there. And like, I don't want to sound too cliche, but like, as a Métis person, we are considered Indigenous people, but we're kind of like somewhere in the middle between colonial and First Nation. And as a two-spirited person, again, you're kind of like somewhere in the middle with the gender and sexuality and whatnot. And but I think our role, I can't say historically, but currently, is just owning up to that and rediscovering it and accepting it and promoting it, saying, yes, like, we are valid, we are real, we never went away, and we remember, and we're here to stay. So yeah, I could go on, but I think I'll leave it there. So.
And thank you, Cory, for sharing your perspective. So I really like that sort of word you used about rediscovering, because I think that that's super accurate too, right? That it's like, we are in this process now of what is the role of two-spirit people, and is it a single role, or is it, like Dorian mentioned, all of these things potentially. And then I like how you ended it. We're valid, real, still here, and here to stay. So that's really beautiful. But for me, I know that historically, some folks said that in some communities, two-spirit people were revered or really respected for being gender diverse people and having these different forms of sexualities. And I think the opposite is also true, right? That in certain communities, we were just a part of society and not filling these revered roles or anything. And then you hear lots of people, I think, talk about how there's a spiritual component to being two-spirit. And they say, two-spirit people were ceremonial people and medicine people. And I know that to be true in some cases, but I also want to caution against, sort of, like I said earlier, pigeonholing, but romanticizing or essentializing the role of two-spirit people, because I think historically and today, two-spirit people were warriors, they were leaders, they were educators and peacemakers and all of these different things, right? And I think that the same is true today. So I really liked this conversation, and we'll jump into this sort of third question now. And I'll invite Dorian to share first, but the question is, what are some contemporary issues or important matters impacting Two-Spirit Métis community?
I mean, it sounds facile, but really everything, because we are, we're people who exist in the world, we're people who exist within this country. And anything in that space is going to affect our community in a variety of ways. But like, off the top of my head, and this ties into what I was saying in the previous one about like the potential like two-spirit people carry as people like building bridges or connecting parts of our community. I think we have a huge role in things like the struggle for environmental justice or against police brutality, which really predominantly affects those of us who can't pass for white, and then also our Indigenous and Black kin here. Like, those are places where like we really are, like I said, it's our kin, it's our community who are deeply affected by things like that, and especially our Indigenous relations are profoundly affected by that. And I think we need to, I guess, involve ourselves in those things and stand alongside them and be part of that movement for change. I think that's one of the biggest issues affecting Métis people, and like in general, and by extension Two-Spirit Métis people at this present time, is just that need to stand in solidarity, both with other Métis people who are directly affected, but with other Indigenous folks who need our support, and with whom we need to present a united front, so that, like, you know, various colonial governments and non-government forces, corporations, things like that, can't pick us apart and divide us. I think a lot of the time Métis people in particular get targeted and sort of courted by these colonial forces, and I think we really need to resist that, and resist the urge to be, I guess, bribed into assimilating with them in those ways, in favor of standing with the people who need us and who we need in turn. That got a little polemic, but yeah, I really do feel that that's the big thing, is just the need to stand together with our Indigenous community as a whole, and take our place within those fights that are just so relevant to the world we see when we look around us.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dorian. And you know, as you four panelists know, and others are about to find out, these are sort of some things that we talk about at our local, and we'll talk next actually about what the role of our local is. But so I just really want to thank you for bringing those up. And yeah, just to reiterate, it's like this, that, you know, it's like caring and fighting with and standing in solidarity with our kin and our relatives on really important issues. And so thank you for that, Dorian. And now I'll invite Cory to share next.
So I'm gonna have a real talk here. So I'm involved in government at different levels and policy development and because of employment equity, I'm considered an Indigenous person, and I am. And I recognize I am more or less white passing. And you would be, I guess, not surprised at how many times at the discussion table I'm the only Indigenous person. But because I'm white passing, you know, they say, oh, okay, so you're on board with this. And often I'm the lone objector, and I'm like, no, I'm not on board with this. And to go back to what the previous presenter talked about, is often when I'm looking at policy and government documents, now with electronic documents, you can search keywords. I search Indigenous and environment. And it's quite clear when certain people or parties or institutes write certain documents, because there is not one mention, one at all, of Indigenous or environment. And I'm like, so when you're purposely excluding Indigenous people, that's a big problem. And when you're not recognizing that the world we live in is the environment, that's a big deal. So for me, like, those two issues are very close to my heart. And I cannot speak for all of Two-Spirited people, but I definitely say that Indigenous rights and environmental rights and protection and fighting for those are something we should do and continue to do. And also fighting for and advocating for a right for gender and sexual diversity representation and human rights and all that stuff. Yeah, it's tough, you know, like, I'm Métis, I'm a bit of a rebel, you know, I'm gender and sexually diverse, so I hate when roles and responsibilities are forced upon me. So I'm like, I can do whatever I want. And I think Métis people and everyone else should do whatever they want. But we definitely have to fight. We have to continue fighting for this, because otherwise everything we fought for the last 150, 200, 300 years all the gains we made can be wiped out with one government act or seriously eroded with one government act. So we have to fight hard. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Cory. This conversation already is awakening my fighting spirit, so it feels really good. But I appreciate what you said there, Cory, about what's particularly important from your perspective. And I also really like the example you shared, and as another sort of white passing, straight passing person who checks off those two boxes of being like a queer Indigenous person. I have been invited to many tables as an Indigenous representative, and when I look around, I'm the only Indigenous person there. And so now, as I actively sort of bring that into the conversations, just because I want folks to know that even though they've, I've probably been invited there because I'd make them less uncomfortable than other people, that I'm not going to let them be comfortable. So that's that's my new role in those meetings. But anyways, I'll open this up now for Lucy to add on.
I really resonate with what you said, Cory, there about roles and responsibilities forced on us because of two-spiritedness or indigeneity. I think that's a really big issue affecting the Two-Spirit Métis community, but also other Indigenous communities, that commodification of identity. And like, I was going to talk about resource extraction a little bit, but that's also a form of resource extraction, right? Like the resources of our lands are being taken, but also the resources of ourselves and our bodies and our minds are being taken as well. So I think that's a really important issue to kind of keep on the forefront of our mind. And, like that resource extraction, the Native Youth Sexual Health Network did a report about how there's that link between resource extraction and harm against Two-Spirit and Indigenous women. So I think that's really something really important to be keeping in mind when we kind of push for acknowledgement of other issues or matters in our nation. And as well, something that came to mind as folks were talking, like I also, of course, recognize that I'm white passing, but not all Métis are white passing or white coded. This happens to be a panel with white passing Métis, but I think it's really important as Two-Spirit Métis people to be standing up for issues that impact more deeply visibly Indigenous kin as well, right? So police brutality, as Dorian mentioned, but also like addressing anti-Blackness in our communities and in our circles and those intersections as well, right? I mean, like, look at what happened with Black Lives Matter Toronto during the Pride Parade in Toronto a few years ago. Just because folks have one marginalized identity doesn't mean that they necessarily understand the experiences or give space to those experiences of other communities. So I think that we, as Two-Spirit Métis people, should be standing up and creating, not just like providing space if people show up, but creating space specifically for like Black, Métis, Two-Spirit people to be able to have those spaces and those voices in our communities and in our governance structures as well. And the last thing I'll say is just that often there's a focus on like youth mobilization as a issue or something important, but I think that's also wrong. Like the youth are mobilized. It's just that people won't support or get out of the way for the youth to actually be able to do the work to lead our communities in these new directions. And really, like, those are those teachings that have been taken away through colonization, right? Like communities were led by the elders and the youth. And we listen to the elders. That seems to be like every governance meeting, like panels, we always have elders there. And of course that's important, but we're missing that youth voice. And again, creating those spaces and recognizing that youth need to be there and getting out of their way to let them tell us what we should be doing next.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for adding on to the conversation. I think your last point was so spot on too, around, the youth are already doing such great, important work. And we need to support what they're doing and to, step back and let them take up more roles in our own governance structures and as leaders and all these other things. I think that's really important. A couple of the things that, you know, I had been sort of thinking about personally of areas of importance that I think, you know, we should be working on or working towards. An area that's particularly interesting to me from a research perspective is weeding out some of these like settler colonial European and Christian influences on our bodies and our genders and sexualities. And you mentioned, Lucy, you know, creating space for BIPOC, creating space, I think, creating BIPOC spaces and also making space for BIPOC voices. And I also second that for, you know, making space for Métis people too, because sometimes we're excluded from the conversation. And so I really appreciate this space being created for us to come here and share today. And so I think generally Métis people being involved in particular Two-Spirit Métis people being involved is really important as well. So we have one last question we're going to chat about, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A with everyone in the audience, if you have any burning questions to ask. But so I'll just, and if folks on the panel feel like they've answered this question, they can simply pass or they can reiterate what they said. But just wondering, what role does or should the Two-Spirit Michif Local have as part of, you know, MMF governance or as part of Métis community building or Métis Two-Spirit community building? And so I might open it up. I might go back to our, again, first panelist and see if Cory wants to start us off.
Sure, I will gladly answer. So I can't go into the full details, but I was one of the first Métis citizens in Manitoba to be issued a non-binary Métis card, and that was something I had advocated for and worked for, and that this Two-Spirit Local that I'm currently part of, the Two-Spirit Michif Local, really pushed and supported that. And the Métis Association discussed it and they thought it was a great idea. And so what should we be doing? So we're officially recognized now, and this local's recognized. And I think we should continue to advance, I don't want to say agenda. I can't think of a better English word right now, but push for our rights and advocate for the issues that we care about. And you know what, small steps, like organizations come and go, but like movements generally, once they're established, they stick around. And I really hope that like 20, 30 years from now, there's going to be a new generation or a second, third generation of queer, two-spirited Métis people who have a local to belong to, and we are firmly entrenched within Métis society. So yeah, that's what I hope for.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Cory. And of course, a massive here acknowledgement of the work that Cory did with the MMF to get those non-binary gender identification cards for Métis citizens. So thank you so much for that, Cory. Truly championed that work on behalf of all Two-Spirit and queer LGBTQ plus Métis citizens in Manitoba. So thank you so much for that. I really liked what you sort of talked about at the end about how like kind of movements stick around, and once you're firmly entrenched, you know, that you move forward. And I remember when the local first started, and it was so exciting, and people were reaching out to us from, you know, all over Western Canada about starting their own kind of Two-Spirit locals, and that has petered down. But that petered down actually makes me feel better, because I know other folks are doing that work in their own respective, provincial areas. And so that's really exciting. But so thank you, Cory, for sharing that. And next I'll open it up to Lucy, I believe. I'm just trying to remember our order here.
Perfect, thanks, Nicki. So I guess there's kind of two pieces to that, right? Like what does the local do, and also what should the local do? So in terms of what does the local do, I think for me, it's an amazing place to be able to sit with community members who have, similar or shared lived experiences. Back before COVID, when things were normal, we had some awesome, we have like the boring local meetings, minutes, like those things too, of course, but we have some amazing like community building stuff as well. So beading circles and just coming together to share food and build those relationships. So I think that's been like a really amazing addition to our community, and being able to create like resources, emergency resources for Two-Spirit folks in our community if they need. If we gave away money at Christmas time last year, and as well like have some money in case folks go through crisis in the community and they need to access some of that support. So I think that like that's just like an invaluable resource for the community. But as for what role should the local have? For me, I think the establishment of the local was like, precedent setting. This is the first local like this that's not based geographically, but it's based on us coming together with this shared identity. And I think I would love for our government to call on the collective knowledge of this local, because there's so many experts and people who've had years and years of this like amazing experience, and different organizations. Some are academics, some are in government structures, some are creative folks. Like we have a lot to offer. So I would love for our local to be able to be somehow part of some of that decision making that goes on. Like as a queer local with mostly, I would say, I'll use the same term we use in the Mumway Project, which is like young-ish, that we're, I'm definitely not a youth anymore, but the young-ish kind of generally speaking of the local. Like we have fresh ideas and perspectives and perhaps even solutions to problems that our government doesn't know about, right? Because no one can know everything. So we can identify some of those gaps, like Cory did with the gender identification on our cards, right? These are things that perhaps folks might not have thought of. So I would love for our nation's governments to call on the local to bring all of these strengths to their tables and enhance the amazing work that our government does for our people. Like community and nation building outside of the MMF is happening every day as well. Like some of that on the ground work, and there's amazing Two-Spirit folks at the helm of a lot of it. So I think this is only the beginning of hearing about things that are going on from folks involved with our local, that's for sure.
Thanks, Lucy, for sharing that. I really liked how you sort of organized what you shared between, what we do and what we want to do or what we should be doing. And I really appreciate that you acknowledge that it's like part of the role of the local is just this relationship building, right? It's like all of us coming together to build community, and I really love that. And that for me was always such an important point of the local, and not to get mixed into the politics, of what's going on in Métis governance, but to just be there for each other and to provide this like safe home. So I really appreciate that. And then of course also, yes, please draw on our knowledge and expertise. There's so many talented folks, really bright folks, really strong folks in our local, and like it's such an opportunity. I think that the MMF and the MNC and other folks could draw on. So we're here as a resource, and please use us. So I'm going to open it up now for Dorian.
Hi. Yeah. I think Cory and Lucy have both covered a lot of bases, and I don't want to just reiterate what they said, so I'll focus on a couple of nicher things. And I'm stealing Lucy's format as well. So as far as roles the local already serves, one thing I really appreciated on discovering the local existed is that in addition to representing me as a Two-Spirit person, obviously, the vast majority of the locals, there's a couple other non-geographic ones since this one was started, I believe, but the vast majority are geographic, and I'm not in Manitoba. And like, obviously, I have deep ties to the Winnipeg region. As I said, my family has had deep ties to that region for 150 years, more than that. But I'm not there, and so issues that are discussed in regional locals like just are not things that I can really speak to with any clarity. And so before I transferred my citizenship to the Two-Spirit Local, like, I had no incentive to be involved in like Métis government at all. And so finding a place where like I can feel like I have something meaningful to contribute is really important. And for me, that's because I'm literally not there, but I'm sure there's other people who like feel they can speak more effectively or make more of a difference involving themselves in the sphere of the Two-Spirit Local than they could in a setting more focused on issues that are delineated by geography. So I think that's a really valuable role that it serves. And then as far as what it could look like, I'm going to echo what Lucy said about, and Nicki, you as well, about just there being valuable input we could have to our Métis governments at large. And I'm about to wade into extremely murky waters as far as Métis politics, but I promise I am not going to get really into the weeds of it. I'm going to bring up the Métis Nation of Ontario. And basically, the only thing I want to say is that their governance structure includes a youth council, a veterans council, and a women's council, all of which directly advise their primary council, which is made up of their cabinet and their regional representatives. Like, all of those councils have really direct input. And the Two-Spirit Working Group, which I'm part of, is looking at ways for Two-Spirit people to be more involved in their governance. And one of the things that's been talked about in that group at length is the possibility of, like, implementing another council for Two-Spirit people that, again, just has this really direct path to advocate for Two-Spirit people's concerns at the council level. And I think something like that is like the type of role I would really love to see the Two-Spirit Local take on. Something where like we can choose a representative who like is in there at like the meetings of the regional representatives or at the meetings of the cabinet to like make our voice heard in a really direct way, because there are a lot of issues on which we have unique perspectives and really valuable experience to draw from. So like, I think that's something we absolutely have to offer, and it's just a matter of finding the best way to communicate with our Métis governments on making that knowledge available.
Thank you, Dorian, for that. And thank you also for mentioning, so I know some folks might not be familiar with what Métis locals are really, but of course they are sort of this grassroots, this sort of really community-based part of the MMF's governance structure. And most of the locals, as Dorian pointed out, are geographically defined. So they're in a particular neighborhood or in a particular community. Whereas our local and a couple of others, like there's the New Elders local, I believe, and maybe a women's local too that was started recently or is in plans. So we are one of the very few more, I guess, identity-based and non-geographic groups. So thanks for pointing that out, Dorian, for folks who might have not been familiar. And then I also want to say, thank you for that last, and the Bison local, which serves students at the University of Manitoba. Thanks, Lucy. And so I want to thank you for mentioning that last point about, how important I think it is to have Métis Two-Spirit people, LGBTQ plus Two-Spirit people represented on these different, governing bodies in our nation. So in a really meaningful way, like having some dedicated spots, the way that Two-Spirits in Motion has created now these dedicated spots for Métis 2S people. So really appreciate you sharing that.
For a sec, Nicki, I just wanted to say that the Two-Spirits in Motion position also, like, that's a full voting position. And I think that is what's really also really important, is like we want these spaces created, but we also don't just want to be like, come in and share a story and then leave and that's it, right? And I don't think, like for the MNO, the Youth Council, that position is a non-voting position on the upper council, right? So like, I love the idea of having those different councils, but it'd be great to have those councils, but then also have some power that goes behind.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I didn't mean to represent that we should be moving directly to their model.
Yeah.
It's a good point, because I actually think here in Manitoba, there is a youth seat on the cabinet, but I don't think the youth seat gets a vote. It's like an informational role. So again, that youth seat should have a vote, because that's where actually having some power and influence at those tables comes from, is being able to weigh in on the decision in a meaningful way through your vote. So thanks for pointing that out, Lucy and Dorian, for raising that point as well. I had just wanted to sort of tack on right before we move into the Q&A that, you know, kind of some areas that I see the Two-Spirit Michif Local, where I see us, you know, hopefully having influence or continuing to do good work. And that's in continuing to make, I think, the experience of Two-Spirit Métis people in Manitoba and potentially elsewhere across the homeland easier through the things like what Cory did, right? Was like really, you know, sharing with the MMF how important it is to be able to have this like non-binary gender designation on our ID cards, so that folks, you know, don't have to go through the like, oh, how do, you know, do I put an F here or an M? Like, and having that other option can be really, can be life-saving, right? And can be so helpful for new people who are applying for citizenship with the Manitoba Metis Federation. So continuing to doing some really cool groundbreaking stuff like that, and you know, and also making sure that like we are bringing those interests and having some influence in our governing bodies, like Dorian said, and then also the relationship piece, which is so crucial. So we actually just had a Pride talent show last week, I think it was, and it was so much fun. Like, it was just such a wonderful evening, truly, where we kind of got to come together, and there was even folks from outside of our community who were there and outside of the local, and it was just such this sort of beautiful moment of being able to come together, which has been obviously really difficult because of COVID, but I hope that our local keeps being able to do those kinds of things as well, as you know, gather and have fun and laugh in a way that is so Métis, right? That we come together and we celebrate and we play cards and we sit around the table and we play spoons. And so, so anyways, I think that's it in terms of what we wanted to share. I'd like to open it up for Q&A, but also open it up if Cory, Dorian, and Lucy have any final words they might want to share. And I guess you can put questions in the chat, and or raise your hand, I guess would also, or I see Julia's unmuted, so I'm just going to mute myself.
I think that if you have questions, you are able to unmute yourself. But if putting it in the chat is easier, then we can also do that too. So.
It's like the Zoom awkward silence time where.
Yeah, I was like, not all at once, folks. And you, some folks have private messaged me and may have private messaged also other speakers too with questions that I've answered in the chat, which I assume will remain private because of the way they've contacted us. But, and again, that's another way, of course, that you can get together with them. I'm happy to put our Two-Spirit Michif Local email address into the chat if people want to contact us about learning more about the local or transferring into our local potentially, or even just registering generally as a citizen of the Métis Nation.
So this isn't a question, it's just something I'm gonna state for clarification purposes. So 20 years ago, I was like the golden child of scholarships and awards and you name it. And 20 years later, I don't get as much attention. A lot of water's been gone under the bridge, but I'm 40-ish and I still consider myself young, but what I've really kind of learned is now how I'm situated is I'm actually at a position in life, in an age where people actually listen, and I have enough power politically and through work and whatnot where I can actually make some of these changes. But 20 years ago, I wanted to make more or less these same changes. I just couldn't articulate it as well, and I wasn't in a position of power. And it's not like I'm the, how can I say, but I just really wish that institutions and governments and organizations would really listen to the 20-year-olds, the 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, the 30-year-olds, because like what I'm feeling right now, I felt 20 years ago, but it was just, I couldn't leverage. I didn't have the leverage. And now 20 years later, I have the leverage to make some of these changes, right? So I really think we have to listen to our youth more. And that kind of ties back into some of the previous conversations.
I was gonna say, I love what you just shared, Cory, and like, it's just so, like, not funny is the wrong word, but ironic, I guess, that like you have had these like brilliant ideas for decades, but people don't listen until later. And it's just like, it's also kind of upsetting also in a way to think of how many people could have been impacted earlier if folks had taken your voice seriously earlier. And I think we have the opportunity to not make that mistake with our youth now. So as change makers, we should be prioritizing that. So thanks for bringing that up, Cory.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good point because folks find it really easy to dismiss youth, but I think their input is so valuable. So just thanks for sharing that. So I got a question in the chat. It is a private message, but I'm going to share it because it's not sensitive at all. And I'll invite, even folks in the audience if you want to answer. But so there's a question, are there any historical references or accounts of 2S or LGBTQ Métis people? So historically. So I guess, again, I'd love to open that up to folks who want to contribute, but I will say this, that Métis communities in particular, I find that, they were so impacted by settler colonialism and especially Christian influences that it's just not something that I think you typically find in like the priest journals. And there's not a lot of photographic evidence. Like I know I've seen some photos of Two-Spirit families from First Nations families, but not really much Métis. But I see Kai, I'm gonna open it up.
Danche. Yes, I was thinking about this because when I think the first question was about like, historical context and things. And this is something that I've done a lot of research on, and I'm still doing research on it, but I wanted to share two names with people off the top of my head. The first person, so there's like two individuals that I've learned about who were like, historical figures that were Métis and what we would call like LGBTQ or Two-Spirit today. One was a buffalo hunter named Antoine Clément, and he was actually an older cousin of Gabriel Dumont, who lived like early. He was lived earlier in the 1800s than Dumont, but he had a relationship with a Scottish lord who came to North America, and he ended up like traveling around Europe and the Middle East with him, and then came back to North America. So that's like, he's got a really wild story. And then the other person is Mary Duquesne, who's also known as Francois Duquesne, who lived in Winnipeg and was essentially like what we would probably call like a transgender woman. She was arrested in 1879 for, I believe, prostitution and just like generally like quote unquote cross-dressing. But she was very insistent on her identity as a woman. And I've been trying to learn more about her, but I can put their names in the chat as well. But I just really wanted to share that. And yeah, if any other people are interested in that, I would love to talk more at some point.
Kai, thank you so much for sharing. Those are two such great stories. May I ask, are you Métis?
Yeah, I live in the United States. I was born in the US, but my grandmother's family is from Winnipeg.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna reach out to you. Do you mind private messaging me your email address?
Yeah, sure. And you can ask Lucy too, because Lucy knows me.
Okay, great.
Kai's part of the Mumway project. So
oh wow, that's so exciting.
And defending their dissertation on Monday. So send really
Whoa,
good luck
congrats.
to Kai for that.
Good luck. Good luck.
Thank you. Merci.
So wow. Thank you so much for sharing. I so rarely you hear these stories, so it's so great when you hear them, because it's like what Cory said, right? We existed and we are still here, and so it really confirms that. So I want to thank you for that question. And there was, I think, a comment to you, Kai, about writing the names of those folks in the chat, if you could. And then again, I'm gonna reach out. I'm in the middle of my own research on Métis and Two-Spirit relationships to place and land in Winnipeg. So I'm gonna reach out to you very soon. Thank you for that. So I'm just gonna make sure that I didn't miss any other questions. Okay, any other questions or comments that folks might have or wanted to add on to that conversation as well?
I have a question. Something that is really, I guess, at the forefront of a lot of conversations with Indigenous identity are like the people that are faking Indigenous identity, like the big scandal at Queen's with the people that are claiming to be Indigenous but actually don't have any Indigenous ancestors. And I found that, or it's common knowledge, I think, that some of these pretendians, it's easy for them to claim to be Métis because maybe they're white passing. So I'm wondering how you folks feel about what are some ways that we can not necessarily protect the culture, but to ensure that Métis identity isn't used in a way where we have people coming in and making claim to it.
Julia, that's a super interesting question. So I think you're speaking to like this this race shifting happening, or some folks say settler self-indigenization. So this like tendency, I guess, for a lot of folks who happen to be in Eastern Canada, sort of claiming an Indigenous identity based on an ancestor that they have from the 1600s, and who in some cases isn't even Indigenous. And it does in particular, I think, impact the Métis community. And I actually don't know that it's just simply because some Métis folks happen to be white passing. I think it's because there is a misconception that Métis means mixed. And so they think, oh, I have this 400-year-old Indigenous ancestor, and then, the 400 years worth of French or other ancestors. So I'm mixed and thus Métis. So I think, again, it's about shifting our idea of what Métis means. For me, I find the idea of Métis being mixed as really problematic because it opens doors for race shifting. And I mean, again, as the chair of a local, I'm contacted, every few weeks by folks who want to transfer into our local or apply for citizenship with the Métis Nation. And lots of folks who contact me say, hey, I'm First Nations, my partner is European descended. Can I apply for my Métis card? And I'm like, no, but luckily you might be able to apply for status, but so there's this really misconception, these bad ideas about what it means to be mixed. And as a Métis person, I have Métis ancestors. I have, you know, generations and generations of Métis ancestors, and both of my parents are Métis. So I guess I would say, I'll open this up to the panel, but I guess what I would say is that one way to avoid this is to stop using self-identification, especially for Métis people, as the way that people identify. So when we have jobs that are for Indigenous people, we typically say just self-identify on our cover letter. It's not enough, because it's so easy for people to claim a false identity through self-identification. I want to say, like, as a Métis person, I have my script documents. I have my genealogy going back to the 1600s. Like, I literally know when my French forefathers came over and when they partnered and the Métis Nation was created. So, I mean, it's like, I can show you that, you know, like, we don't need to rely on self-identification. If you're a Métis person, you know you're Métis because you have supporting documents the same way that First Nations people do. So I guess, anyways, I'll open it up. This gets me so heated.
Can I go? Like, this is such a great question. Like, you know, such a great question. So I really hate, and hate's a strong word, but I really hate the idea of blood quanta. And there's that like DNA testing 23andMe. And I'm not going to say who, but one of my immediate family members did that 23andMe, and it's like, you're X percentage First Nation, and like, I just wanted to throttle them. So I really hate blood quanta, but yeah, it's kind of like, well, it is a shame that people who aren't Indigenous are self-identifying as Indigenous to receive some perceived benefits. And I guess where I'm going with this is, I always look at it from a flip side. I have members of my family who deny their Indigenous heritage, and there's still a lot of shame with being Indigenous. So like 30% of Manitoba, 20% of Manitoba is Indigenous, and less than half self-identify, right? So like, you have the entire spectrum of like people who aren't Indigenous claiming to be Indigenous, and then you have legit Indigenous people who are not self-identifying, right? But this is where it kind of gets sticky. Like, for gender and sexual identity, I firmly believe that should always be self-identify. But if you are Métis, I agree, it's not mixed. And it's a distinct culture. It's from communities. There's historical, there's ancestors. And I do believe the MMF has a good process for issuing Métis citizen cards and whatnot. I must caution, though, the fact that I do know Métis people who are just on the wrong side of the fence and were not able to get Métis cards. So I do worry about that. But I could ramble on more, but it's definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, may I say a couple words as well?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dorian.
Yeah, I guess, and this is something I'm always very aware of, because I'm Métis, and I am also mixed. Like I said, my dad's family are all just plain old, they're just white people, white settlers. And also I live in Ottawa, which is, it's not really ground zero for this race shifting movement, but a couple of the most prominent figures who have done the most to sort of further that discourse in the mainstream are based here. So like, it's something I'm always very cognizant of, and it's bad. It sucks. And I think a lot of it stems from people's habit of thinking of indigeneity as something that is just about race, when obviously like indigenous identity is really, it's it's a cultural identity and it's a national identity. It's about sovereignty. It's not just about like blood descent. It's about being a member of a sovereign culture and community. And I think that's a paradigm shift that just a lot of non-Indigenous Canadians have not like gone through. So that's one point. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on is just underlining what Cory said about how part of what makes this conversation so difficult and like such a charged one to have is that there's people who genuinely have been disconnected from their community for one reason or another, and it's really hard to find the ways to safely welcome those people in while not leaving room for like the race shifters to like exploit those people, which they're already really doing. They're exploiting people's inability to connect with their own communities, and then they're saying like, oh, but don't worry, you can find a place with us. And like that's something I think we need to be really careful of, and like find a way to welcome in our kin who, you know, for whatever reason their documentation has not been preserved as meticulously as that of like, you know, your family, Nicki, or my family. Like mine is very well documented, so that they don't fail to get like citizenship because of a lack of documentation and then go, oh, but the Eastern Woodland Métis will accept me with what I do have. Because I do see that kind of thing happening, and then those people who do genuinely have a claim to community and have just lost part of that connection end up being drafted as like a tool in the hands of these fake communities that you know then weaponize them to like dismantle our sovereignty, and that's a really ugly and awful thing.
I'll just add on a little bit, but you know, I would like to think that part of it is education, so people not understanding, I mean, like what Métis means, but also not knowing the histories of the ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples in this country. Like, perhaps this is my rose-colored glasses, but I'd like to believe that people wouldn't falsely claim these identities if they knew more about like the intergenerational trauma that you have to carry as part of that legacy, right? Like that trauma that sits in your body for generations because of things that have happened to your family and to your ancestors, right? So perhaps some of it would come from more education, but education can't fix everything, right? So I do appreciate also what Cory said about like folks don't have cards for a lot of different reasons. And I mean, one of them now, a lot of folks are kind of turning away from these governance structures because of all of the kind of the way that things have played out for the last number of years. And all of these conversations are really happening because we're living under these colonial definitions of membership in our nations. Both First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities we're kind of like stuck with this colonial test, I guess, to prove our communities, but without actually having to have those kinship relationships, without having to show up for our community members, without having to be there for our aunties and our grandmas and our cousins. And I think that's really a big shift, because like when you go into a room full of Métis folks, for example, when you come to like when I first came to the first like local meeting, we were like, oh, like who are your ancestors? Where are you from? Like you ask those questions naturally. And for me, that's the definition of who should be claiming those spaces, more so than like a card. But if you can't have those conversations, then perhaps that's, even if you have some mixedness in your past, that's probably not your place to take up, right? So like, how can you, it's one thing I try to teach the students that I work with is like, it's amazing that you found connections in your ancestry to amazing people, but how can you work as someone who has an Indigenous ancestor, not someone who's Indigenous because of their long lost ancestor as well. So I think we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of, it's not just Queens, it's definitely not just Queens. So it's a really, yeah, it's really interesting questions. Thanks for raising that, Julia.
Thanks for the response. It really, to have these race shifters, it really like triggers me, and I feel like I have like a trauma response almost. So to hear you guys offering your support really means a lot to me as Métis kin. So thank you very much for sharing. I think Joanne has her hand raised. Let me see if I can.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, hello. I just want to make a comment. My mother was the person who hid the Indigenous heritage from us, and her mother was First Nations full. So she's long passed and gone, and most of her relatives are gone too. There's 3 left in the family of 16. We need to, I personalize this only because I feel I've got to get the story from these people and what their shame is all about, because that's what kind of blocks me from embracing any of that Indigenous culture. I feel very French. I'm very much in line with that heritage or that part of it, because it is a mingling with it. And I've been Métis for a long, long time, 1997, or since I was born, but my card I was given in 1997. I think we need to really urge those loved ones. I wish I could ask my mom, what was it that happened? Can you please tell me, why the shame sort of came on your generation? But prior to that, her grandfather was quite a esteemed Métis person in Manitoba. So, I'm just wondering what happened to that bit. And I'm really urging my nieces and nephews to start questioning their aunts and uncles before they disappear, because we need to have that connection to it. I would like to know. And that's kind of all I wanted to say. And thank you.
I'd love to just offer a quick comment there. Thanks for that, Joanne. I think in my family as well, there was a time of kind of a hiding of who we were. And I think you're right that a lot of that comes from trauma and from pain as well, because when we talk about the history of the Métis in Manitoba, like after the Red River Resistance and the Northwest Resistance, a lot of folks had to hide their identities rather than continue to be tormented by these like colonial officers, like the Northwest Mounted Police and Garnet Wolseley and all of these people that came, these actors that came to wreak havoc on our communities. I think a lot of it, I used to be really harsh on my ancestors. We have one story my mom, or my grandpa told me about being at the kitchen table and hearing one of their cousins was knocking on the door. And he just remembers like his parents saying like, we're not helping them anymore, or we're not talking to them anymore. So they just really separated themselves from some of their family and stepped away. And so like for me, I was really mad about it for a long time, but I think a lot of it's also just self-preservation. Watching other families have their children taken away from them and having all of this violence. Like I have gotten to a place where I can't blame my ancestors for the choices they made to preserve themselves and their connections. But I can make efforts now to rebuild those connections and be a better family member to those branches of my family as well.
I just wanted to, hi mom. Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. It's good to hear. And I obviously I never knew your mom personally. She died when I was very young, but I've talked with this about this a lot to Carly, my cousin, her niece, for those of you who are not part of our family. And one thing she shared is that when our grandparents married, like when your mother married a Ukrainian man, his family wanted very little to do with her or with their children. Like Lynn has memories from when she was very young of like her Ukrainian grandparents just not wanting anything to do with her. And I think being shut out by part of your own family is something that can lead to a lot of that shame and a lot of that like wanting to bury the aspects of yourself that people are rejecting. And I think that's hard. And then obviously, like, yeah, there are people in our generation who are doing that work of reconnecting, and I'm so glad to see, you know, that you are doing that work of reconnecting as well. And I know Lynn is, and probably some of my other aunts and uncles as well. And like, it's nice to see that those connections can be rebuilt, because there is that strong base there are those strong roots we have. Yeah, it's hard work, and it's work that taps into a lot of trauma. And like Lucy said, I don't think, you know, it's hard to bear any ill will against people for doing what they had to survive and to protect their families. But, you know, now that things are, you know, there's still a lot of problems that we deal with in our communities, but now that it's safer to just openly to claim your family and to be part of your family and to like nurture those connections, I'm glad that more people are feeling able to do that and take part in that.
So if it's okay, I'll add on to this. So my grandmother on my mom's side, she's Métis, Indigenous, and just from the few small stories that I got, her mother, so my great grandmother, was very Indigenous. And see, I think at that time, I'm not saying Indigenous women only married and had kids with non-Indigenous men, but for a certain period of time in Manitoba, that was more frequently the case. And when an Indigenous woman married into a white family or a white man, often she had to kind of, I'm not going to say deny her heritage, but just kind of be quiet about it. So it was kind of a learned response. And then that kind of history wasn't passed on to her kids, which is a real shame. And I don't want to make vast generalizations, but for a long time, a lot of Métis people lived in poverty, and even today. And especially 20, 30, 40, 50, 80 years ago, there was shame attached with poverty. And that was really closely linked to being Indigenous, because if you were Indigenous, you were poor. So like, where does the shame start and end? And often non-Indigenous people were wealthier, right? So we have to recognize that fact. And yeah, like, it's just kind of a tangled weave of generational stories and generational patterns that led to the shame and our lost heritage.
Thanks for that, Cory. Actually, thanks for that, everyone. I also want to share a personal experience of my own mother. So I was raised, as I mentioned, by my mother and father are both Métis. And my father was always super proud, really vocal about Métis culture and identity and history, which was really great growing up. And he still makes bannock all the time, his mother's recipe, and or la galette, as we call it, in our family. But my mother, on the other hand, she was actually, she never really talked about being Métis. And it was very clear that there was like some shame happening there. And it was kind of funny in our family, because her mother was so visibly Indigenous, but we never talked about it. We just talked about my dad being Métis. And my mom had been raised by her grandmother, who was a non-Indigenous woman, a French woman, who had actually married a Cree Métis man. And he was so proud of his culture, and they raised their children to be proud of Métis culture. But I think in part through their education, they started being shamed for being Métis. And so the kids stopped talking about being Métis and stopped participating in Métis things. And I remember, you know, when I started learning about Métis culture in university and started becoming much more involved in the Métis community at that point, that I wanted my family to participate in that journey with me. And I know it was a little, you know, it was a little more difficult getting my mom to become involved. And at one point I remember we went over to my aunt's house, who's sort of our family historian, and we were learning all about, you know, these relatives that we had, these famous, you know, men and women and others in the Métis Nation who were, you know, we're so proud to have. And I remember my aunt, my great aunt, she's like 90, saying something like to me and my mother about how my grandmother who had raised, my great grandmother who had raised my mom, she said she would have been so upset to think that her children aren't proud to be Métis, because she was so proud, you know, that her husband and her family were Métis and they were raising them that way. And I think for my mom, something really clicked, right? She didn't want to, like, she was like, I never meant to disappoint, you know, this woman. And so she started her own journey of coming into Métis identity and becoming more involved in Métis politics. It's been less than a decade, like it's probably been 5 years, folks. And she is today the chair of the Lorette Métis Local. So she came really far in a super short time. But so I mean, folks are taking up that journey, right? And taking up that work of, you know, what is my role in community? Who am I? How do I fit in here? How do I become more involved? And so I just wanted to share that story and my mom's experience, because it can happen really quickly and it can happen really well. And so I recognize now that, Joanne, I'm gonna stop talking so that you can, because I think your hand's back up.
Okay, yeah, no, I just want, and this is on a more documentation level. When I first got my blue book, it was in 1997. It was not long after my mom died. And I don't know why she was so ashamed of her Native heritage, but she was. And when I did look at the blue book, which I received from the St. Boniface Museum, André Fortier, because he was a specialist on Pierre Delorme, they took script. But what I noticed more than anything was, more often than not, especially pre-1940, 1930, the Native women had no name. They were squaw, they were Indian woman, they were, you know, and it was part of my documentation. And I thought, well, now my book is long gone. I don't know what my 11 other family members did with it, but I'm not sure if they're still practicing that today. But it's something I wonder if we should continue. You know, I don't know why it's still part of, you know, those terms are still used. When I did ask the André Fortier, the fellow at the St. Boniface Museum, he told me it was because they had no names. I said, oh, okay. But yes, it was disturbing. And I hope that does not still continue to this day, but it was really quite a shock to me to see. That's all.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Joanne. It does still happen. My genealogies contain the same language of like Cree woman or Indian woman. And it's not because they didn't have a name, it's because their names weren't recorded. And it's because of heteropatriarchy and misogyny, frankly, that we didn't care really who these women were. These mothers of the Métis Nation, these women who we now know created Métis culture and transmitted Métis culture and still do. We just didn't care enough really to write their names down. Well, not we, we I'm sure care a lot, but the Indian agents and whatnot who were creating these records didn't care, and the priests and whatnot as well. So. I think that is in part of the problem, is that now we have to recover those stories, and in some cases it will be very difficult. Other thoughts on that from the panel?
So also my genealogy, you can go back and there's Jane Cree, Mary Cree, a lot of Crees. And at first I thought that was strange, but like as I became more of aware of our history and like erasure of these people, like it it really saddens me. Like, and I'm a poet, and I wrote a little poem, and part of it's how one of my great to the great grandmothers lost her real name and was recorded as Jane Cree. And I've actually read literature of current day people writing kind of not fan fiction, but just like trying to write stories and fill in the gaps for these women who lost their names. But it's really difficult to actually find any real history for these women because they were more or less erased from history, right? So.
Yeah, it's hard. And then I guess the other comment I wanted to make is like, the genealogies are a really great tool for beginning to explore your connection to family. Like I have a copy of my aunt's, but there's so much just a start to the story. Like it's a list of names, it's some documents, and it's only a direct line of descent. So like I know the family line that the direct line of descent for my family, my Métis family, all the way back to like the 1500s. The St. Boniface Genealogical Society is shockingly thorough. But I don't know anything about their siblings or like the extended family trees at all. So like I have done the research to find like, like my great aunts and great uncles as best I can. Like I've been able to find some of those people's names, but like, second cousins or third cousins, people who have the same great grandparents I do or whatever, I have no way of finding because I don't know like my grandmother's siblings or like who their children might have been. I don't know my great grandparents' siblings, and like that's the sort of thing you really need the family stories for. And then when those connections are severed, whether it's because your family doesn't talk about things, or as in my case, my grandmother died when I was too young to really have any conversations I've ever remembered with her. Like it's tough when those things are cut short.
So I'm not trying to steal too much of the spotlight here, but I have a very distinctive last name. And if you have the last name in Manitoba, you're related to me. And it was funny, about 10 years ago, we saw our last name in the Winnipeg Free Press, and me and my cousins, who are all about the same age, like, who is this person? Like, I don't know this person. And it seems like my grandfather's side of the family had a family dispute 40, 50, 60 years ago, and they kind of split. And they all kind of agreed, let's not talk about it, right? So like there's a branch of the family that kind of went on and did its own thing. And like my dad and my uncle and whatnot kind of like, yeah, we know about it, but we were never really supposed to talk about it. And it just like, maybe it's my modern sensibility, but I'm just like, I have a branch of the family I didn't even know about, like, and I kind of felt like that was stolen from me. So slightly different than what you're talking about, but I can see like, yeah, like you don't have the entire picture if you don't know all your relations, right? Like the uncles, the aunts, the cousins, the siblings and whatnot. And often those were kind of lost in history and lost in the genealogies, and people went their own separate ways. I'm done, by the way.
Thanks, Cory. So I don't see any other mics going unmuted, so I'm going to assume that we've answered that. Oh, nice. Lucy's posted a poem. Go ahead, Julia.
Well, thank you guys for sharing so much. I definitely learned a lot, and it just feels so nourishing to the spirit to be surrounded by other Métis folks in the community. So thank you for all the good work that you do, and thank you for sharing your voices with everyone here today, and thank you everyone for joining as well. Yeah, do you guys have any closing remarks?
No, I also wanted to thank Cory and Dorian and Lucy for making themselves available tonight, and for you, Julia, and the Winnipeg Art Gallery for hosting this kitchen table talk. It's so nice to be able to gather with other Métis folks and other folks generally. So we just want to say a big kitchen merci to you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you everyone thank you for the opportunity, to you, Julia, and to you, Nicki, for reaching out to me. And thank you to everyone who came and listened, to the multiple members of my family who have been here through all of this. It's been nice to have that support. It's just been a really nice evening.
I also want to say this has been wonderful. It's really beautiful to get together with your community and to talk about your family and your relations and your history. And I don't get a chance to do that often. So it really makes me, fills my heart, and I need to stop talking. Otherwise I'm going to start crying.
Yeah, just merci KOL. This has been awesome. There were some cool chats about ideas for teachers. I think it was Adele was writing about that, and my position at the U of M, you might have missed my introduction, but I'm teaching future teachers now, so I'd love to connect if anyone wants to talk about some of those changes that they see as necessary in the institution. So I'm putting my email in the chat, so anyone who would like to reach out, that'd be fantastic. Well, merci again, everyone.
Okay, great. Well, I hope everyone has a great weekend and stay safe. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Julia.